Okay. So thanks everybody for joining us. I think we're all kind of old pros at this now. We know to keep our microphones muted and our videos off during the talk. And today our speaker has asked for you to, yes, please do ask questions, but it's best if you queue them up for the end for a longer conversation. So if questions occur to you during the talk, feel free to type them in the chat window and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. If something more urgent is troubling you, like there's a problem with the audio or video, please do bring it up and let us know what's going on. Announcements. We've got a couple openings in the seminar series in 2 and 3 weeks from today. We've had a few cancellations. So if you know someone who's looking to give a talk, perhaps you know someone who's just published a cool paper, or you're just about ready to present that annual progress review and you have some cool results you'd like to share more broadly, please do reach out to me and we'll schedule you in to give a talk. But today we're extremely fortunate to have a special external guest speaker. We have Helen Oleynikova, whose name I hopefully didn't butcher too badly. And Helen has recently finished her PhD in the Autonomous Systems Lab at ETH Zürich with Professor Roland Siegwart. Her thesis was on mapping and planning for safe collision avoidance on board micro-aerial vehicles. Helen is now a senior scientist at the Mixed Reality Robotics team at the Microsoft Mixed Reality and AI Lab in Zurich. She's worked on a plethora of different robotic platforms, from robotic boats to drones and a variety of ground robots. And she's passionate about the intersection of perception and action, just like many of us here, and making real robots just a little bit more intelligent. So the title of Helen's talk today is Mixed Reality, Volumetric Mapping and Robotics, Sharing Spaces with Robots. So we're very grateful for you joining us today from Zurich today, Helen, at this early hour for you. Please do take it away.
Thanks so much for the intro, and yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. There'll be quite a lot of videos and I hope interesting stuff in this talk, so feel free to pop open a beer since I know it's a bit late there on a Thursday. And I hope you find this interesting, and I'm really looking forward to having an engaging discussion at the end. So a little bit about me. So I've been doing robotics for a little bit over 10 years now. I did my bachelor's in engineering with a concentration in robotics in the US at Olin College of Engineering, where I worked on some robotics boats, ping pong playing robots, and a variety of things. After bachelor's, I decided I wanted to know how to make real stuff really work. So I went to Google for 2 years and worked on Street View, where I worked both on, more boring cloud service backend engineering and also some more fun machine learning for recognizing, for example, street numbers and imagery, and also I'm sorry, it's very early in the morning here. Coffee hasn't quite kicked in. Yeah, then I went to do my master's at ETH Zurich, where I worked on stereo vision localization for drones, and then did my PhD in mechanical engineering on dense mapping, planning, and drones, which I'll talk about in some length during this talk. And finally, since September 2019, I've been a senior scientist at the Mixed Reality and AI Lab in Zurich. And I'll talk about that work in the end and kind of how everything fits together and relates, and where I see, these parts of robotics going in the future. So a little bit about my PhD. So as I've said a few times now, mapping and planning for drones. So the goal of my PhD was for drones to avoid collisions in unknown unstructured environments, and kind of the what I brought to the field, I think, was to consider the mapping and planning problem together. So, not just as a planning person assume that you have a perfect representation of the environment, and not just assume as a mapping person that you have 4 GPUs to play with and all that matters is getting the best possible representation, but really design map representations that are best exploited by the planner, but also compact enough and efficient enough to run on board and have just the information that's actually necessary for planning. And on the planning side, just exploit all of the information that's available to you. So kind of the main outcome of my PhD was a flexible mapping framework called voxblox, which I'll talk about, and a couple of local planners for collision avoidance, and a little bit of work in global planning. So Probably my favorite experiment that I did throughout this time was this one in the forest. So here we just told the drone, okay, go forward 40 meters, don't hit anything. And as you can see, it's going through quite a dense forest. There's no prior map on the bottom right-hand corner. You can see the map it's building up in real time. This is a top view of a 3D map, and it's actively replanning its path through this environment. I'm the one operating the camera. As you can see by the shaky camera, I'm actually struggling to navigate through this. So I think this was a super cool result of, being able to, with no prior information in a fairly cluttered environment, just send the drone in and have it operate safely and get to its destination. So outline of this talk. So first we'll talk how robots can represent their environment, kind of some big picture stuff and my thoughts. My thoughts on the subject. We'll dive deeper into volumetric mapping since that has been kind of the focus of my PhD. And I'll talk a little bit about my work and also the work of some of my collaborators during the PhD and since. Then we'll switch gears and talk about my work at Microsoft, introduce kind of what is mixed reality, what can it do for robots. We'll show some examples of mixed reality and robot interaction. And finally, talk kind of about how I see the future of sharing spatial understanding between robots and humans, and how mixed reality fits into this and how volumetric mapping fits into this. Yeah, let's talk about how robots represent space. So as I'm sure you're all very familiar, for space representations, there's a lot of different sensors you can use, all with their quirks. So you can cameras, depth cameras, 2D LiDAR, 3D LiDAR, and a variety of others depending on the application. And also depending on the applications, there's many different map representations with different densities and different properties, and that are used for different things. So, for example, the types of maps you usually use for localization are not the same maps that you use for path planning and navigation. The kind of maps you use to represent like object detections are different still. So a few examples of the commonly used ones are, as I'm sure you're familiar. So here we have sparse sparse visual feature maps. So this is, I think, a screenshot from PTAM. So this is usually used for state estimation and localization. Then you have semi-dense maps, and then you have dense volumetric representations that are used for either full 3D reconstruction or, as I've talked about, path planning. And then, of course, the kind of where I think robotics is going, semantics is becoming more and more important, right? We're solving more and more of these fundamental problems of like, where am I? Where can I go? And going a lot more into where should I be going? What is around me? How do I interpret it? How do I do intelligent things? And there's, of course, different map representations that are more amenable to that. But of course, I'll talk much more about volumetric mapping. I think this is a really valuable type of map representation and a kind of just a rich way of representing space. To me personally, I feel like this is how I understand space, right? Like, where is there stuff? What's occupied? What's not? What is free space? So kind of the advantage of volumetric representations is they explicitly model both occupied and free space. It's also continuous in many, many air quotes, in that you can normally in volumetric representations, you can look up any point in the space and you have some information about that. If you just have a sparse point cloud or like a visual feature map, if you look up any point in the space, you might just know whether there's a feature point exactly there or not, but you don't have any information about whether it's actually free or occupied or unknown. So I think this is really the richness of these representations, and of course they're great for path planning. So when I started my PhD, the most commonly used map representation in 3D for robots was Octomap, which is quite powerful and fast. So basically, as I hope you're all aware, you have a quad tree of voxels, and each voxel stores its probability of occupancy, and then you get these nice blocky visualizations at the end. And this is very powerful for planning. You can tell where occupied space is, you can tell where unknown space is, you can tell where free space is. But this has a few disadvantages. You're really locked to the voxel resolution. As you can tell from this visualization, someone who's not a roboticist has a really hard time interpreting what's going on in this scene. And it's not particularly fast. So what I did in my PhD was kind of steal ideas from graphics and computer vision, which is to use truncated signed distance fields, which I'll talk about, define a little bit more in a second, and kind of which are normally used to create really high resolution 3D reconstructions that look good and people can interpret, and kind of convert them into something a little bit more robotics friendly, where you don't care about it looking nice so much, but you want it to run fast on a computer from 2011 that you have on your drone. So what are assigned distance fields? So in this talk, we'll talk about two different types. So the first is the truncated signed distance field. So this is what's kind of used in graphics to do 3D reconstruction. So the idea is to use projective distances and truncate these distances to a small radius around a surface. So this is all basically hacks to speed up the fusing data. So here you can see if this is the camera and this is the surface, the projective distance would be the distance along the projection ray. And then they're truncated to just near the surface, because this is obviously, a pretty just an approximation of what the actual distance to the surface is, and the further away you get from the surface, the bigger the error grows. And then the second type is the Euclidean signed distance field, which is the actual Euclidean distance to the surface. So here you can see this is the shortest distance to the surface. And these are normally not truncated, and this representation is used a lot in path planning because you're able to look up collision costs at any point in the map, even further from surfaces. So the core idea of my work, which was voxblox, is to incrementally build Euclidean signed distance fields out of truncated signed distance fields, since you already have.
Oh, you all right? We're not hearing you just now. Uh-oh, the fancy new headset has failed us.
Can you hear me now?
Here we are. Yep, you're back.
Okay, perfect. My headset has decided I'm not using it enough and to turn off.
Oh, no. Okay.
Cool. All right. That's good. Yes. So sorry about the interruption. Yes. So since you already have distance information in the space to to exploit what you already have in the map to kind of build up these full distance maps more quickly. And here's a little bit about how the system works. So you have sensor data in, you get a pose estimate. Also externally on robots, you can kind of assume that you anyway have to estimate your pose in some way. So we skip the step of doing this directly in the map. You integrate the truncated signed distance field. So again, this graphics representation that gives you a nice 3D map. And then you have two separate layers that both, that you keep up to date with the truncated signed distance field. One where you build the full Euclidean signed distance field, and also one where you build the mesh. And so the mesh can be used for visualization, and the Euclidean signed distance field can be used for planning, and I'll show in a second for other applications. So here's kind of what building these maps looks like in practice. So my colleague is flying a drone through a space to do a 3D reconstruction. And so we're able to build this all live and on board the drone. And the voxel sizes are quite large, which is why the map doesn't look so great, but for planning purposes, this is kind of exactly the right resolution. And here you see a 2D slice of what the truncated signed distance field looks like, and then what the Euclidean signed distance field looks like. So as you can see, you really have collision costs everywhere in the map. And that field is a full 3D representation. We just visualize a 2D slice. And here's a quick example of how this can be used for path planning. So you can set a start and a goal, and then there's a global planner, and then local plans throughout this signed distance field, which can do this very actively. And of course, you can use this, as I've shown before, onboard robots for planning. So here we have in green a global plan that's now in collision, and the thinner colored lines are the local planner actively replanning around obstacles. So that's kind of the state I got to in my PhD. I've been very lucky to collaborate with some excellent researchers on kind of taking this further from just having a map that you can plan in, but actually getting my dream is to get to a point where you only need the volumetric maps and you don't need anything else. So in all of the work I've shown so far, we've just been building kind of one monolithic map. So basically, you assume your robot odometry is good. You just fuse everything together into one map. Hope you don't drift too much and call it good, which works fine in really small environments or for short demos and so on and so forth, but doesn't work in larger spaces and doesn't really scale very well. So the idea is to, instead of building one kind of one big map, we instead build submaps. And kind of keep, your robot odometry is not going to drift very much over a short period of time, but over time this drift accumulates. So you can fuse together data over short periods into submaps fairly safely, assuming your odometry is good enough, but then you want to keep them separate to be able to optimize them over time. And my collaborators and I built a system called voxgraph, which lets you basically do a postgraph optimization on maps of postgraphs of dense submaps. So here we see how this looks like in a large-scale experiment. So this is a drone flying over a large search and rescue training area in Switzerland, and you'll see as it goes around that the map kind of snaps into place. So the odometry is obviously drifting. This is trajectory of hundreds of meters, but by exploiting the information in the signed distance fields, we're able to very quickly and cheaply kind of snap the volumetric data together by basically matching the surfaces and doing quick lookups in the signed distance field for the nearest neighbor part of ICP. And I think this is quite exciting work that kind of lets us handle larger spaces. But of course, if your odometry drifts more, if you have, kind of more complex environments, you can't do everything just with snapping kind of neighboring submaps together with ICP. You actually need to also have loop closure. So here we show an experiment where we do loop closure using dynamic bag of words. So here it's drifted quite a bit, and with the loop closure, the whole map snaps together. But as I've said before, this experiment actually required using the visual data with dynamic bag of words, and I want to get to the point where we can do everything just in the volumetric maps. So this has been more recent work from my colleague Alex and myself. So the idea here is to take this map and then recognize that these two submaps are actually representing the same space, and be able to basically do place recognition in dense volumetric submaps in signed distance fields. So the idea of his work is to actually exploit the structure of the full Euclidean signed distance field to make this problem easier and more distinctive. So here, here we have a 3D map broken up into submaps. Here's all the submaps together. And so the idea of this work is to really exploit not just the structure of the surface, as most work does, but actually the structure of the free space. So this work is called Features, and it's been submitted to ICRA. And the idea is to find kind of local maxima and saddle points in this in the free space of the Euclidean sign distance field and design a descriptor that describes that, that's distinctive enough for place recognition. So here we see kind of the visualized in color, the local maxima of the sign distance field and the feature points that we detect and extract descriptors. Then by matching this local free space information, we actually have a really distinctive descriptor. Sorry, so that you can match across submaps. So here you can see how this works in two specific scenes. So there are also some features that are found like near the surface, but quite a lot of the features are in free space. And so here we'll see some more experiments from a drone, so flying around and collecting this in the same search and rescue training area, as you can tell we love to use for experiments. And then being able to kind of match only partially overlapping maps together. So here's one long trajectory in blue and one short one in yellow. And by extracting features in the free space here, we're able to match these together. And as you can see, that's a pretty good match. So this actually outperforms, the state-of-the-art surface-based features on most environments by 10 to 15%. It is more expensive to compute the full Euclidean sign distance field, but if you have that already for path planning, I think this is a really engaging work in trying to solve all of these problems using only dense maps. So moving on to the second part of the talk about our work at the Mixed Reality Lab in Zurich. So I'll talk a little bit about mixed reality, what it is, how it relates to robots, where is all of this going. So what is mixed reality? It's all of the terms are a little confusing and they're not used in a very consistent way. So I'll just define what I see commonly used, but this is definitely not the only way to use these terms. So virtual reality generally refers to, you have a headset on, you can only see what's in the headset. You don't see anything from the real world, you just see the digital representation. And then augmented reality, this is often used on phones, so you're able to see some digital overlay on top of the real world, so you can hold your cell phone up and see like, oh, this is the Starbucks is this way or whatever, but you can't really interact with objects in the digital world. You're only able to overlay. And then mixed realities, you can interact both with the real world and the digital world. So we talk a lot about we'll talk about the HoloLens specifically, but there you have like hand tracking and you can interact with holograms similar to how you interact with real physical objects. And this is the Microsoft, big picture vision talk slide. Sorry. So we've had personal computers for quite a while now, which really revolutionized how we do work and interact with one another and so on. But laptop doesn't know where it is. You're basically just stuck with a stationary thing, which you can use to work, but there's no information about the environment. The next step has been smartphones, where you have a camera, you have a lot more information about your environment, and you can kind of use this for cool experiences. And we think the next thing is really mixed reality. So you bring everything in the digital and physical world together, and you don't really see the borders between what's digital and what's real anymore. Our work has been primarily with the Microsoft HoloLens 2. So I hope you guys are aware it exists. This is a mixed reality headset where you have basically a clear display that can display holograms. So you still see the real world, but you optionally see information displayed on top of it. And this thing is basically just a robot on your head. So you'll see a lot of familiar sensor packages here. So we have a RGB camera for video conferencing. There's 4 head tracking cameras. They're grayscale. You run VIO, IMU, of course. And there's also a depth camera in the front, which is used both for reconstructing your environment and also for hand tracking. And there's also IR cameras and IR LEDs for tracking where your eyeballs are looking, and a live microphone array for hearing what you're saying. So again, pretty much same thing as a robot. And this slide will also look very familiar to those who do perception on robots. So the head tracking algorithms are, as I've said, it's just visual inertial odometry. It's exactly what runs on your robot. The only difference is the robot is attached to your head. And there's also depth sensing, which allows you to, which is a highly accurate in-house depth module, which allows you to reconstruct your environment and look at your hands. And of course, the built-in capabilities are also very similar to what you get on robots. Here is a live 3D reconstruction that the HoloLens is running on board, so that you have some perception of the environment. You can render occlusions in the holographic content. We can kind of guide you. We can make sure that like holograms aren't behind a wall or something, and really exploit the free space information in this map. And on the right is kind of what the map looks like. And there's also some automatic semantics extracted. So here you have some object classes. So for instance, wall, floor, and so on. This is also kind of extracted live as you're using the device that you can exploit this information for more immersive experiences. So how can all of this be used together with robots? So I think there's really 2 parts to that. So you know, in research, we get to see a lot of cool robots doing a lot of really cool things that really only work once for a video. If you look at what robots are currently being used in industrial spaces and in commercial spaces, and what robots are people paying money for now, it turns out it's actually mainly logistics. Like, this is the problem that's constrained enough and simple enough that robots are like really good at this already, and it works more than once for a video. But I think the future is really bringing a lot of these applications that we currently see in research into also robots that people actually buy. So in warehouse scenarios, construction, search and rescue, and a lot of other fields. And this involves increasing robot intelligence, increasing robot spatial intelligence, having better representations of the environment, having more capabilities. And that overlaps a lot with, you know, also what the HoloLens needs to do. And of course, a really big part, I think, is humans and robots working together. So I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but it's the way we kind of use robots and interact with robots and get into insight into what robots are doing is there's really a lot of room for improvement there. And like non-experts have a really hard time like figuring out like what an octomap means, and like figuring out where the robot is in RViz and where they actually want to send the goal. And I think there's a lot we can really leverage a lot from having a more natural way to interact with robots, and have non-experts be able to guide robots in more complex tasks than they can currently do fully autonomously. So here's one of the demos we did in the lab. So here you see the traditional way of working. You have RViz, you have the robot. You have to try to figure out by squinting at the map where in the office the robot is right now exactly, and kind of just use your own internal model of the world to figure out what it makes sense for it to do. And here you see kind of what a demo with the HoloLens. So this is the pass-through view of the HoloLens. So you can see the holograms that I see overlaid. I look really cool right now with a headset poking at holograms. I think this is the future. So you can see in purple, you see the current pose of the robot overlaid. I can set, you know, commands kind of in 3D space in my view, and have the robot go there. And we also enable some cool interactions with hand gesture recognition. So this was work done by my colleagues on the action recognition team. And so the gesture here is come here. You just tell the robot to come here like this, and it does eventually, which I don't know, it's a super cool experience because, you know, like the step from in Arvis sending it to a goal while trying to kind of guess where it is and where the place you want it to go is, to just, you know, standing in a space and telling a robot to come here and it does it, it's massive. And of course there's other valuable applications for this technology, which I think are relevant at 5:30 p.m. on a Thursday. Which is really, you know, robots collaborating with humans on the really important things in life, like bringing you a beer. So that was kind of like how the interaction works, but how do you get to the point where you can do the interaction? So the important thing is to be co-localized with your robot. And the way we've done it in these two demos is to actually build a full 3D map of the environment using the HoloLens 2. So this is in blue, you see the overlay of the mesh on the space. Then basically we convert the mesh back to a signed distance field. Then out of the signed distance field, we basically extract a 2D slice to get a 2D LiDAR map that then the robot can use for localization. We send this to the robot and have the robot localized against this map. So here's the map we've kind of extracted out of the HoloLens mesh. And here's the interaction that we're able to enable to co-localize the human and the HoloLens. And I mean, this works pretty well, but it's you have to admit it's a little bit of a handful to have to fully 3D scan a space before you can like co-localize with your robot. So the more recent work we've done is for doing this with vision-based localization. So this is the work of my intern in Seattle on using the Spot, on interacting with the Spot using the HoloLens. So he wrote a ROS wrapper for Spot. Now ClearPath also has one. And here we're using Azure Spatial Anchors, which is a Azure cloud service for vision-based localization, which until about a month ago only worked on HoloLens and phone. And now we're able to basically use the Spot's onboard cameras to also localize into this system. So basically all you have to do is, you know, create a spatial anchor, which is basically just a location relative to some visual features, send that spatial anchor ID to the Spot, and you're co-localized in the same space. So here's a little bit about how the system works. So you get images on phones, you get images and poses from AR, so AR Core, AR Kit, whatever. On HoloLens, you get the same from the head tracking, so the 6 degree of freedom track pose estimation that you have on board the HoloLens. And you send these image features and poses to the cloud, and you can either create anchors and or query existing anchors. So again, this is just a vision-based cloud localization system. And what we've done is added an interface to let you kind of bring your own SLAM system and bring your robot. All you need is images and poses, and you feed it into the system and you're localized. Works out of the box. And we have currently, I want to advertise this a little bit, we currently have a tutorial on IROS on exactly this. IROS is free, as I'm sure you're all aware. If this has been interesting, kind of all of the demos I showed in mixed reality are basically you can replicate all of them. We have sample code. We walk you through exactly how to do this. You don't need a HoloLens. We have tutorials on how to do this with your mobile phone. It's a little less fun, but still gets the point across. And also how to use this Azure Spatial Anchor's Linux SDK to co-localize with different devices and across robots. So the question is kind of what's next? Like, how do these, so we showed interacting with robots in mixed reality. How does this fit together? Where are we going? What's the next bit to unlock here? And I think that's really shared spatial understanding and shared spatial representations. As I've said before, the HoloLens is basically just a robot on your face. So I think we can really exploit a lot of the same data that's being built up by the HoloLens. HoloLens can benefit from robot data as well, as they tend to have better sensors than you can stick on your face. And really just the vision is to really go to like a shared representation of the space where you have an understanding of what's around you in whatever format is most appropriate for your application. And so here's an example. So this is actually a really common commercial problem. So if you have logistics robots from two different manufacturers, they both have 2D LiDAR on there. They're using the same exact algorithms to localize and navigate, but they're not cross-compatible because everything is just kind of locked to the manufacturer, but the maps are exactly the same. So if you can share the maps between them or align the maps between them, then you can bring robots from different manufacturers into like the same coordinate space. And that's kind of a trivial example, but there's also, if you have a robot with, that needs a little bit more information than just 2D LiDAR maps, and you need a full 3D representation of the space, then having that aligned in a consistent coordinate system is also absolutely key to being able to use the information that's in both maps. And of course you can extend this if you have survey data of your environment, if you have semantics, and if you have other data. So I think the key really here is to bring as many kind of spatial representations as you can into the same space, have everything aligned, and be able to basically from a query point in a 2D LiDAR map, be able to get the like 3D semantic labels of the object that's there. And that's kind of what we're working towards. So in conclusion, so I think volumetric mapping is cool, and it gives us a flexible representation of the space. You can use it for map optimization, can use it, and can also use it for place recognition and localization. Mixed reality allows us to interact with robots. And I think really the next steps is kind of bringing these two aspects together. So different map representations, volumetric mapping, and sharing these between robots and humans. And I want to do a little bit more advertising. So we're currently hiring for a number of positions, including researcher, specifically in perception, so either from robotics or from computer vision, and we're also specifically hiring a software engineer in robotics. So this is kind of a bachelor or master's level job. So I'll send links to all of this later in the chat. But if you're interested, if the work, especially in the second half of the presentation, has been interesting to you, and you want to move to Zurich, please consider. And yeah, thanks a lot for the time. And I'm hoping to have an engaging discussion in the 20 minutes we have left.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen, for a super engaging talk. That was really good. And volumetric mapping is cool.
I'm glad to hear that.
Anyone remains unconvinced, I don't think they were paying attention. So we have Helen for 20 minutes. Let's make good use of her time. Who has some questions? Maybe I can get something kicked off while our audience contemplates. So rewinding to the first half of the talk, you talked about features and the idea of picking out representative points in a free space. Mm-hmm. I didn't quite catch, can you explain, did that ignore visual texture and work entirely on geometry? And if so, what defines a good feature in volume, in free space?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, sorry I didn't go into much depth there. Just showed the nice visualizations. Yes, so it is done. So the features are detected and extracted entirely from the signed distance field information. So there's no texture, there's no color, none of this is used. So what makes a descriptive feature, so I mean, of course, there's two parts, detection and description. So detection I talked about, this is basically the saddle points and the local minima and mostly local maxima. And the descriptor encodes a couple of different pieces of information, but mainly it's the direction of the gradient of the SDF in that space, and distance and distances to the nearest features. Sorry, distances to the nearest surface, so the distance in that space. And in other ways, it's basically similar to an image feature. And kind of what has been really difficult and important in that work has been getting rotation invariance for this 3D feature. But yeah, we found, I think because like if you have the full SDF, you actually have a lot of global information about the space. We found these features to actually be very discriminative, and there's I'll send a link to the paper, but there's also analysis that shows that like you get quite a bit of benefit in extracting these features, not just on the local surfaces, but also in free space. You actually get a performance boost out of not limiting yourself to only what the surface is shaped like, but what the free space is shaped like.
That is very cool. I'm fascinated by the concept of a feature that's in free space. I'm trying to get my head around how sensitive would this be to changes in the scene? So if I was mapping out an office and I moved a chair or a couch, how many of the features in the space would that affect?
So we don't, I'm sending a link to the paper in the side. So we haven't done much analysis on exactly how much the scene has to change before this breaks down.
Sure.
I think that's a really valid point in that you are kind of limited there. So at least from like qualitative experiments with real data, you know, as long as the walls and like the large objects remain in the same space, you have some tolerance to you know, a chair moving as long as the table is still there and so on. But we don't have quantitative metrics on that.
Okay, that's a fantastic result. It's really cool. I see Viorella Ila has a question. Why don't you go ahead, Viorella? Are you with us? You're muted. Nope.
Okay.
There you
Can
are.
you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
Sorry.
you.
So actually, you just answered my question. So I was a little bit puzzled about the registration of those maps. So map registration. You said that it outperforms some methods based on surfaces, but relative to point clouds registration, what can you tell about the registration of maps, volumetric maps?
Yes. Okay. I think so. There's kind of two parts to that, right? So one is kind of getting the rough alignment, so solving the like place recognition problem. If you have two maps that are, you have no idea what the correspondences between them are. So that's what feature solves. Is like you have two random maps, you can figure out the rough best alignment between them, and then to actually get the fine exact alignment for, so the actual exact registration, you do a basically ICP, right?
Okay,
and
so it's basically a point cloud registration.
Yes,
well,
but
based on
you
the
do
features.
get a lot. So you do the rough alignment based on the features, and then for the actual fine alignment, you use the structure again, right? And using the SDF for ICP actually lets you speed this process up a lot, because you can basically skip the nearest neighbor checks. You just need to, you know, pick a point from one map, look it up on the other, and you immediately get the distance to the nearest surface and the gradient. So this is actually, it also kind of really grows your basin of convergence for this, right? So for because you have this distance information, and you don't need to have as good of an initial registration if you have all of the SDF information. And there's some analysis on this on the other paper, which is voxgraph, which I'll send as well in the chat.
Thank
Does
you.
that answer your question?
So I will just look to the numbers in the paper, probably. So regarding the last slide, so that's kind of a holy grail, right? Vision. And of course, there are many types of representations, many types of actual registration between maps. I cannot really imagine now how would you do some semantic representation of the map, register it with a point cloud if you don't have geometric information at all, and things like that. But from the point of view of the representations, for different applications, different representations are more suitable. So what's your view in this direction? So what do you think the volumetric representation is suitable for? In which application you would use, for example, point clouds, in which applications you would use voxels. So I know you might be a little bit biased, but so I'm giving you example of applications. So large scale navigation, okay, so city size maps, indoor navigation, reconstruction of very small objects, for example, so very accurate reconstruction and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, and one I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And like, you know, despite kind of what the tone of the talk is, like, I love volumetric mapping, but I actually don't think it's a solution for all problems. But I think it can be used to fit quite a few. So I think what like kind of signed distance field maps and dense maps are good or so is it's really when you need to know free and occupied space, right? Like if you don't need to know that, you can, if you need to know, for instance, like if you want to have kind of the best, most accurate representation of the space, often like raw point clouds are going to get you that. But the utility can be limited, and if you need to, for instance, do path
what about
planning,
manipulation? So
yeah, so
reconstructing form, recreating the environment for
reconstructing for manipulation, I actually think volumetric maps are the way to go. And I think what's really missing right now is kind of really having proper multi-resolution volumetric maps where you can adaptively, you know, like you don't need to know, you need to know roughly where the table is. You need to know within, like, you know, a centimeter where the table is, but you need to know within millimeters where that notch on the cup that you're going to grasp is. I think there it's really, for manipulation, and especially kind of mobile manipulation, where you really have to couple the action and the perception. I think there's a lot of work to still be done there, but like I'm personally pretty convinced that like signed distance field maps are the way to go there.
Thank you, and thank you for excellent talk. It was very interesting, and it's interesting to know what Microsoft and HoloLens up for too. And thank you. Sorry for I'm actually walking my baby in the campus here.
It's nice to see summer and the outside world. So thank you for that, and thank you for the really interesting questions.
Very good.
So
I see that if we can have you for a few more minutes, I see Stuart Effort has a question for you.
Hi, yeah, it's Eifert, Stuart Eifert.
Effort.
Yeah, hi guys. Hi Helen. So you kind of just actually answered this one a little bit. It's a question about utility of maps, so still mapping again. And you mentioned, like at the beginning of your talk, that you were doing mapping for planning, obviously, and like the considerations of that were like, you know, real time, speed and computation, and the ability to consider like free versus occupied and the distance to occupied, I guess. But I was just wondering what other considerations were like important for that idea of like mapping for prediction, like whether maybe some sort of like goal oriented consideration versus just like obstacle was taken into account. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not, so do you mean like kind of more high level task understanding or I'm not sure. understand exactly what you're asking.
Well, maybe it wasn't the right question to ask. And I had thought talking about like mapping for planning, it was like like you'd been creating a map with the idea of enabling a planner to work better or more efficiently or something. And I was just wondering maybe what other considerations were important to allow that, and whether, because one of the main tasks of planning obviously is reaching a goal, and whether some sort of like consideration of where the goal was in relation to each of these features within the map might have been taken into consideration.
Yes, so I mean, I think also I didn't talk about the planning parts at all. So there's a couple of different things I explored in that space. So so the main thing there was getting the full Euclidean sign distance field built incrementally over the whole space, so that and a lot of the work I did in planning was having to deal with like only having partial information, having a ton of unknown space, and like for example, a common problem that I had in like very practical applications was, you know where your goal is, you don't have a volume, like you don't have data there. It's an unknown space. And how do you kind of push the goal back into known space, and like kind of exploiting the sign distance information there? How do you treat unknown space and collision costs has been was kind of central to the work of like, okay, if we want to really have something operate safely, then we have to make sure that the goal point is always in known mapped space. And so like one of the things there, one of the considerations there was when you go from truncated sign distance field, where like if you haven't seen it, it doesn't exist, to going to the Euclidean sign distance field where you need to be able to look up the collision costs at any point. How do you do that for unknown space? And like coming up with heuristics and ways to kind of expand the environment, marking all of the unknown spaces as occupied was something that was kind of crucial for making this work for safe planning. Because if you don't do this and you just say, okay, any space I haven't seen is free, and you have a drone that can't see up, and there's an obstacle in front, the first thing the drone does is just slam very happily at full speed into the ceiling because it's free space. So I think there's a lot of like really practical considerations like that if you just do maps for graphics or looking nice or computer vision purposes, you never ever encounter these problems. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it definitely does. Thanks. That's cool.
Don, can I jump in?
Go for it, Steph.
Yeah, thanks, Helen, for the talk. It was great. Really enjoyed it. It struck me that you talked about how for the cool demo you needed to work once, and then you publish the paper, and off you go. And I think I heard a virtual fist pump when you said the HoloLens just works out of the box. So, what do you think the sort of insights have been that have allowed these systems to become robust and sort of commodity objects? And what do you think the key challenges are that still can keep kind of research going over the next few years that will continue to improve?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So I think for really a lot of these problems, there's an initial research solution out there, and like, yeah, sure, okay, it's only worked once in a video, but like in terms of the interesting science problems, I think there's, for most of the problems we've bothered to consider, there is like some solution exists, and what's missing from making it actually work out of the box and every time, it's just engineering. It's just engineering and robustness. It's getting every test case. It's getting every corner condition. It's really, writing the code well and doing good engineering. And it's, I think, for really a lot of what's missing in robotics right now, of course, there's tons of like really open research problems, and all of this needs to be pushed forward. But I think kind of the next step in getting robotics to work is really pumping enough money and engineering effort into just doing the boring work of making this stuff robust. And I think, and I really hope to see that effort from across, multiple companies in the next years. And I have pretty good insight on exactly what's running on the HoloLens, and it's no different at all from what's kind of running on drones, what's running on research robots. The only difference is they had more engineers kind of ironing out the bugs and really testing the system and making it robust.
Steph's second half of his question was around keeping the research questions rolling. So what do you see then as some of the open research problems that aren't well addressed now?
And I guess maybe,
so,
Don, if I could follow,
yeah.
if I could also, how do we make sure that that effort that's gone into the, industrialization, the engineering, kind of feeds back into the research, so that we're not kind of left 10 years behind with things that sort of barely work, and you can buy something off the shelf that's pretty robust.
Yeah, so I mean, my personal view on this is like industry needs to be open sourcing this stuff. Like, I think open source is the only way this is going to move forward, and it's a win-win for everyone, right? Like, researchers do free work for industry if they can build on top of open source industry stuff, and of course, industry kind of pushes research forward. It's kind of easy for me to say because I'm not the one having to make the business plans for this. But in my view, like the only way we're gonna get this to work is industry has to contribute back to research. There's no other way. And in terms of what I think the open research problems are, I mean, I didn't mean to like disparage research, but I think one big area is how basically robots understand the world. Like I showed very basic, okay, you have a sensor return, you just put that in the map, things are there, things aren't there. I think really a lot of semantics, having higher task level understanding, being able to act more like act with more intelligence, make your own decisions, not just have missions be pre-programmed. I think that's one huge area. One thing I personally really want to work on is mobile manipulation, because I think it's like a lot of the technology, a lot of the problems there are similar to problems in other areas. And I think there's a lot of just putting all of the pieces together into a compelling system that can not just drive around and have space from point A to point B, but like also manipulate and so on. And I think, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for that. So Dorian Tsai, who's joined us from Brisbane, has been patiently typing away in the chat window. I guess his voice and camera aren't working. So he's got a couple somewhat technical questions. And the first is to do with where exactly does that speed up come from when you're comparing the truncated signed distance function to the Euclidean one?
So there's not. Right. Okay. Yes. I get what the question is asking. Yes. So computing so basically the speed up on getting the truncated signed distance field versus the Euclidean is looking up the distances. So if you use the projective distance, if you have your camera pose and a point, you know the projective distance. That's it. Like that's all you need to know to get the projective distance. To get the true Euclidean distance, you actually need more global information, right? So like, it's not enough to just know one point on the camera pose. You also need to know all the other points that you get, and so you have to do more of a lookup and kind of fuse this together. So by using the projective distance, you kind of approximate the problem. And like, of course, as you get further away from the surface, this error grows really fast, which is why it's truncated. Because if you start, and maybe I'll send I did some experiments on basically like, oh yeah, I mean, they're both signed distances. You can just like fuse them together somehow, right? Like, why are you doing all this complex stuff? The error is huge. You literally outside of a small thing around the surface, it's just the data is just complete unusable trash.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I hope that kind of answers that part of the question.
I see an O in the chat window, so I think we got it.
So yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. The second question was actually on my mind as well, and it was how does one cope with uncertainty when working with signed distance functions, basically? Yes.
So this is one thing they're both good at and bad at the same time. So there's so in Octomap, for example, for every voxel, you only have one number, and that number is the probability of occupancy or log odds of occupancy or whatever, and you use a sensor model to, for every return to update that. For truncated time distance fields, you have two numbers, so it's twice as good. One is the distance and the other is the weight. And so what you do when you fuse truncated time distance fields together is you just do a weighted averaging, right? So you have a sensor measurement and you have the voxel value already. You just average them together. And the weight actually, depending on how structured you are in picking the weighting function, you can actually incorporate your sensor model in there, and then your weight can be mapped to the covariance and uncertainty of that point. And this works quite well locally, where you have just within a voxel, you can kind of know the uncertainty of the surface of that voxel. But if you have larger uncertainties, or if you want to incorporate, for instance, your uncertainty about your pose and so on, because you fuse everything together at once, you kind of can't get the original data back. So I think for scenarios with larger uncertainty, then this representation is less well suited, and there's other ones that kind of let you roll back your data a bit better that might be more appropriate.
Maybe some hybrid representation is just waiting to be
exactly
created. So I see that we're past the hour, so thanks for sticking around with us. There was one thing I wanted to make sure I brought up with you. I see from Dorian's comment in the chat window that we've hit his nails on the head, so that's great. Thanks for that.
Excellent.
I've worked a lot with light fields, which is a volumetric representation of the visual texture in the scene. And I wonder if you're aware of any work that has combined the signed distance fields with, not necessarily light fields, but with some representation that isn't a mesh, a textured mesh, of the visual appearance of the scene as well as the geometry.
That's a really excellent question. And I mean, so off the top of my head, not really. So for a lot of these representations, you can also kind of store the color per voxel and so on. But as you saw in the videos, like it doesn't look really good, and it loses all of the kind of high frequency information. You're stuck with one color value for a 20 centimeter voxel, which is pretty pointless at that point. Yeah. So no, not off the top of my head, but I think I fully agree with you that this is that's a really powerful source of information that my work has completely ignored up till now. And I think as you said, also for the I think some hybrid representation where you can like easily exploit both is definitely what's going to take this to the next level.
Interesting. Maybe some future work to do in there. Mm-hmm. Okay, folks. Any more questions for our speaker? Don't see any takers. So perhaps what I'll do is I'll thank you very much, Helen, for joining us. It's been fantastic to hear about your work. I could keep chatting for a long while, but everyone needs to get on with their lives as well. So perhaps we should catch up again sometime before too long and
absolutely, yeah,
continue the conversation. But please join me once again in thanking our speaker. You can type thanks into the chat window or clap, as I see some people are already doing. And a reminder for all of our attendees today that the seminar next week is again at a special time. We have Dr. Vivian Susano Medeiros joining us from PUC University in Rio de Janeiro. So we're getting all around the planet these days. It's pretty fantastic. We're really grateful to our guest speakers for joining us and exposing us to a little bit of what's going on outside of Australia. So thank you, Helen.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the attention, and thanks for the interesting discussion.